Thank you all for joining us today. We are so thankful for this opportunity to gather in person to celebrate the World GIS Day. My name is Sapana Lohani. I am a geospatial data scientist at the IIC, which is Institute for Integrative Conservation. For those of you who have not known what is IIC, it is a unit at William & Mary to slow the global biodiversity loss by educating and professionalizing the next generation of conservation leaders and by increasing the capacity for our conservation partners. The IIC provides a pathway for William & Mary students to enter conservation careers by networking students with our conservation partners and by supporting applied student research and applied conservation projects around the world. Students' support on these conservation projects helps our partners to achieve their conservation goals. Today's event is a part of our conservation speaker series, which this year is Reimagining Protected Area Conservation. These series are produced each year with support of other William & Mary centers, institutes, departments, and resource offices. This morning's event is a part of a World GIS Day event series, which is co-sponsored by the IIC and the University of Richmond, and produced in collaboration with the University of Richmond Digital Scholarship and Spatial Analysis Labs, One Tree Planted, Conservation International, the William & Mary Center for Geospatial Analysis, and the Society for Conservation GIS. Each year, our series follows a particular conservation theme, and this year, like I said before, is Reimagining Protected Area Conservation. This theme calls on us to be open-hearted and open-minded learners to consider multitude ways of perceiving, being in, and relating to each other and to our environments, to examine the foundational assumptions that much conservation is based on, and to explore alternative approaches to conservation in our rapidly changing world. Today we will hear how GIS is helping us to reimagine conservation. Before that, I'll read out the land acknowledgement. William & Mary acknowledges the indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the lands our campus is on today. The Cherenhaka Nottoway, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Pataomic, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respect to their tribal members, past and present. I'm now pleased and honored to introduce our panel moderator, Justin Medron, who is the Associate Director of the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond. He coordinates the development of digital collections, digital scholarship projects, applications, and manages all processes involved in the production and organizations of spatial data for those projects. He is an adjunct lecturer for the Department of Geography and teaches courses in GIS, design, and geovisualization. He is also the program specialist instructor of the School of Professional Studies GIS Certificate Program at the University of Richmond. He is particularly interested in research that involves creating new geospatial data to help tell stories about our past, using the power of GIS and web technologies to reveal new research is at the intersection of his trainings, expertise, and interest. He co-authored and helped develop one of the most impactful digital history projects of the past several years, American Panorama, an atlas of the United States history. American Panorama includes mapping inequality, which is a widely used resource on redlining in the 20th century. Over to you, Justin.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Before I introduce the panel, this is one part of a two-part series. So after this, we'll be heading to the University of Richmond, where we'll have another panel to wrap up the day. So we hope you can join us online for that. So I'll be introducing our wonderful panel today from left to right. First is Robert Rose, the Executive Director, William & Mary Institute of Integrative Conservation. Robert came to William & Mary in 2015 as a director for the Center of Geospatial Analysis. Prior to William & Mary, he spent 7 years at the Wildlife Conservation Society as the Assistant Director of Conservation Support, and when a team provided that technical support and training to conservation programs around the globe. Robert's interests include conservation and conservation planning, the use of GIS and remote sensing to better understand drivers of land change and broader conservation issues, the promotion of remote sensing for conservation applications, and the integration of advanced and interactive geovisualizations tools to better engage students in the classroom. Robert earned his PhD in geography with a minor in ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome, Robert. Next is Sushma Shritha, social scientist, Morris Center for Science, Conservation International. Sushma leads Conservation International's efforts to map lands and waters under the indigenous peoples and local communities' governance and tenure to better understand their contributions to conservation and climate goals. Her research portfolio also includes integrating indigenous knowledge systems into climate research and developing the capacities of indigenous peoples and accessing conservation finance directly. Sushma holds a PhD in biology from Miami University, Ohio, and has worked in the Nepal Himalayas, the Ecuadorian Andes, and the coastal Dominican Republic with indigenous peoples and local communities. Welcome, Sushma. Next is Christina Sabachik, GIS Fellow, William & Mary Center for Geospatial Analysis. Christina is a recent graduate from William & Mary with a BS in biology and environmental science. During her time there, she worked in IIC research projects with American Bird Conservancy, the Santa Fe Conservation Trust, and Conservation International. She also worked for the William & Mary Center for Geospatial Analysis as a teaching assistant for the Geovisualization and Cartography and Chart Community Mapping Project courses, and an intern doing GIS work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Following her graduation after the fall of 2021 semester, she volunteered as an ornithology teaching assistant for the William & Mary Biology Department and worked at the CGA as a spring GIS fellow. Currently, she is working for the CGA as a year-long GIS fellow. Welcome, Christina. Brees Robertson, Director of Impact Assessment and Monitoring, One Tree Planted. Brees combines geospatial technology and storytelling to inspire, activate, educate, and engage people to protect our planet. She is a noteworthy leader in the conservation and parks field with over decades of experience. She created and led the GIS Research and Planning Unit at the Trust for Public Lands and built strategic initiatives like ParkScore, ParkServe, and green printing that use state-of-the-art technology to make data and information accessible. In 2006, she was awarded the Esri Special Achievement of GIS Award, and in 2012, the Making a Difference Award. She authored a book called Protecting the Places We Love, published in April 2021 by Esri Press. When she's not protecting places she loves, she's exploring and enjoying them. Welcome, Brees. I'll turn it over to our first panelist, Robert.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you all so much for being here today, and hello to those of you on Zoom. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the William & Mary Institute for Integrative Conservation, as well as talk about one of our new projects that we're launching that does focus on addressing issues of environmental justice through the use of geographic information systems. The IIC was launched in 2020, in January of 2020, after a short proposal period where an alum came to William & Mary and asked what we were doing differently about conservation. And if we could propose something big, they would consider funding it. My partner, John Spottle, and I came together, wrote the proposal that eventually got funded to launch the Institute for Integrative Conservation. We're an organization that sits under the Provost's office, so it gives us a little bit of a flexibility in terms of how we work and who we work with. The idea of being integrative is to be able to work across campus, and being situated under the Provost's office gives us that opportunity. And we've often been asked, why William and Mary? Why was this the right place to launch an Institute for Integrative Conservation? Well, there's a number of reasons, and they include the expertise that we have across different conservation sectors, including biology and conservation biology, geospatial sciences, Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, as well as law and business practitioners who care about conservation. Probably more importantly is the amazing students that we have here that are entirely committed to helping the world through conservation projects. They're engaged, they're bright, and they want to be part of something to make the world a better place. And so we're building on the fantastic students that we have here to develop what we're doing at the ISC. So we launched with a vision of a world in which people and nature are inextricably, equitably, and justly connected, and the natural environment thrives for current and future generations. And we're doing that through our mission of empowering the next generation of diverse conservation leaders. We came together and wrote a strategic plan that included 4 strategic objectives that really highlight the type of work that we're trying to do. One, we're trying to build external partnership with conservation organizations, private industry, federal and state agencies, tribal organizations around the world in order to engage on conservation projects that matter, meaningful conservation projects that can be addressed to bring solutions to these conservation challenges. Second, we hope to grow and nurture diverse talent in conservation. We launched a major, I'll talk about that in a moment, but we're providing capacity development experiences for our partners around the world. Looking down the road, we hope to establish long-term field sites with our conservation partners to further engage our students and our partners in experiential learning environments that focus on addressing conservation issues on the ground. And finally, connecting knowledge and action to conservation. We recognize that oftentimes great research being done at universities doesn't make it beyond the walls, and so our goal is to really make sure that connection between the research we're doing here and conservation on the ground is seen real life. So what do we mean by integrative conservation? Well, we think about it this way. We obviously focus on biodiversity conservation. That's our focus. But even when we imagine biodiversity conservation, we see a mesh system with humans being part of that vision for the future. But we look at biodiversity conservation through 2 lenses, a lens of well-being and a lens of communities. And the idea here is that we believe in integrating human perspectives, human wellness, human well-being and livelihoods into the practice of conservation. Because for biodiversity conservation to succeed, we need to have healthy communities, and we need to incorporate local knowledge into the conservation plans. We also think about integrative in this way, that we work across campus with people in the law school, the business school, through arts and sciences, marine science and education, as well as bringing together multiple external partners. Since launch, we've built an amazing team that includes Sapana, who you met this morning, Erica Garud, our wonderful program manager for research, Anita Hagee-Ferguson, who's here, is our awesome communications program manager. We built our faculty by hiring 2 environmental justice professors, and we're expanding our team as we speak. A big part of the first 3 years was to really develop and build these partnerships with external organizations. And the idea of building these partnerships was multifold. One, we knew if we built these partnerships, we could bring in their questions and their challenges and connect students to these actual on-the-ground challenges. 2, we felt this was a clear pathway to engaging the partners and bridging that knowledge to action gap. And 3, we want to provide a pathway for students into the practice of conservation. So identify both jobs and opportunities and prepare students through the work that they're going to do with the ISC to join the conservation world. Like I said, we recently launched our major. We believe it's the first undergraduate major of its type in integrative conservation. And as you can imagine, it brings it together classwork on both biodiversity conservation, but communities and well-being are 2 other lenses for those perspectives on conservation. And part of what's grown out of this, a fundamental program that we've launched now, we're in actually our 4th year, is the Conservation Research Program. This is a program that really brings together everything that we try to do in terms of connecting students to real-world conservation projects. It's a year-long program that students get involved in where partners actually apply to be part of the program, and once we identify the projects, we match up students to those projects through an application process, and they begin in January of that year. They spend their first semester working closely with the partner, developing a proposal for their research. In the summer, they get a research stipend to conduct their research, travel if there's an opportunity to travel. Last summer, we had students in the Philippines, Mongolia, Texas, and California. This coming year, we'll be sending students to India, among other places, Madagascar, I believe. And it's really been an amazing program. We're now we get over 40 applicants from our conservation partners every year. And this year, I think we have 24 students that are going to be part of it starting in 2023. And you can see the range of projects that we try to bring in. They're not just straight conservation biology projects. We have a whole range of projects, including geospatial projects. One of those projects, and you'll hear more about it today, was led by Christina Sabachik with Conservation International. In addition to the year-long program, we've now provided an opportunity for students to engage in geospatial projects through a semester-long conservation GIS lab. And the model is exactly the same. We're identifying partners who have challenges, in this case, that are focused on geospatial activities, and we bring those into the classroom and provide students a chance to work on these through the semester. It's a really great opportunity for students to build their skills, build portfolio pieces while working on real-world conservation projects, and partners get the support in areas that they don't currently have the capacity to address. We also see with this program a growing number of partners looking to be involved with this opportunity. A couple of great examples. One, we had a student last year who's actually sitting out here, worked on an analysis for the city of Richmond. They're trying to understand whether the green space that they have really serves the entire city of Richmond. And by serving, we mean within a 10-minute walk from where everybody lives. And so what the student worked on was to identify a map that's shown here that shows the 10-minute walk areas and places that are underserved by green space. This is an opportunity for Richmond to address environmental justice issues by providing more green space where needed. A second project that came out of this, another one worked on by Christina, was the project with the Santa Fe Conservation Trust. It's a small land trust organization out in Santa Fe, and they wanted a story map made. They wanted to share their story. And so Christina and another student, Johnny Peters, worked on this and developed this really incredible story map that's shown to be a huge success. Santa Fe Conservation Trust was able to turn this around and basically raise $1 million through the use of this story map. So it shows the direct impact our students are having on the conservation community. This project also launched a project we're calling Landrise. And this is a project that Brees Robertson, who you'll hear from in a moment, and I have been developing. And we really recognize there is a need from the land trust communities to engage in geospatial analysis to address both environmental justice issues and increase diversity in the land trust and conservation easement process. But oftentimes these small to medium-sized land trust organizations do not have the capacity to engage in geospatial analysis and data-driven decision-making. And so the Landrise project is designed and intended to support those small to medium-sized land trust organizations to expand their work in terms of private land conservation. And the goal of this is really to support the 2030 goal of protecting 30% of the US landscape. As part of the land rise process and project, we hope to provide capacity development to the land trust organizations, so increase their ability to take on this analysis on their own. And we'll be able to, once we launch this, we hope to focus efforts on analysis that address issues like the nature gap, the lack of access to nature from communities around the country, and increase diversity and equity in the private land conservation world. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm going to pass it over to Shushma and for her presentation.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting us here today, Rob and the IISC team, and William and Mary. For those of you who do not know, maybe not know so much about Conservation International, it's a non-governmental organization with the headquarters at the Crystal City, Virginia. And we have offices around the world in 30 countries, and we have been working since the inception in 1987, so over 30 years, and have protected over 6 million hectares of lands and sea all over the world, covering 77 countries. Our staff is about 1,300 members or so, and over 90% of our staffs are from the countries that we work in. My own work at CI is focuses on the reimagining global environmental stewardship through indigenous and local governance, and part of this is we are mapping indigenous peoples and local communities, lands and waters globally. Unfortunately, I cannot show the map of the global map today because we are updating the database, as well as there's a lot of things that we have to sort out in terms of permissions, what data we can show, what data we can share, because these are indigenous peoples and local communities, lands and waters. But what I can share is that we have about 57 data for 57 countries so far, and they are rigorous in terms of not only the boundary data, but we also include, do research and desk review on the legal documents and so on and so forth that recognizes the lands. And we will be, we plan to release this data at the end of this year. But I can give you an example of what I mean, what we do. It's the indigenous peoples and local communities hold at least 50% of the world's lands, and they are effective stewards of these lands and waters. And they are the stewards of the last remaining intact biodiverse forests and areas and lands and waters. And that is very essential for the climate, the biodiversity, and the sustainable development goals that we have. But their contribution is often invisible because the data is not accessible. The spatial tenure governance data is still lacking. That also means then the policymakers, researchers, donors, they are only seeing a partial and fragmented view of who governs the world's lands and waters, so that they can, without that data, they cannot really make that important decisions that they have to make. For example, where to allocate funding, or where are the places that we need to really focus on and conserving. So to fill this gap, CI, the Moore Center of Science, where I work, we are building this spatially explicit and open access database of recognized indigenous peoples and local communities, terrestrial and marine governance and management, and then also mapping the associated tenure rights. as an example that I can provide, this is at the country level. This is Peru. On the left-hand side, you can see the lands that are recognized for indigenous peoples in Peru. On the right-hand side is what is the associated rights. The lighter color, as you can see, where indigenous peoples would only have management rights. And this has some implications as to the self-determination, fulfilling their collective aspirations, even benefit sharing, or even making decisions about what can they make decisions about their own land, and so on and so forth. And having this basic but fundamental information on what lands are recognized where, and what rights people have over their lands and waters, then we can ask more interesting questions, and also really make the invisible visible, right? Like bringing that, highlighting that contributions of indigenous peoples in curbing biodiversity and climate crisis that we are facing currently. This is a map that shows both the lands that are recognized of indigenous peoples within Amazonia, but you can also see what rights they have in there, and that they don't really own all of the lands. They are, in some places, they are just managers of their land. Some places they have rights up to, they can exclude other non-members from their lands, but maybe not do other things. So this also shows highlights the carbon in indigenous people's lands, and they are very high, ranging from up to 200 tons per hectare in their lands. And this is just the carbon, right? But there is also something called irrecoverable carbon that CI has mapped for global lands. And in Amazonia, the irrecoverable carbons are those very vulnerable carbon that we cannot afford to lose if we want to avert the climate catastrophe. And we can also map things like that at very hot spots for both the carbon and biodiversity. And so with the basic information on the land and the rights, then we can start to ask these questions, but also, as I said, make the invisible visible, that is highlighting the contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities for the really healing of the world. As part of this kind of work where we are highlighting the contributions of peoples, Christina worked with us last year, and she worked on the ecosystem services and looking at the spatial relationship between that and the indigenous people's lands. And I'll pass it on to you, Christina, and you can talk more about it. Thanks.
All right, hello everyone. Good morning. My name is Christina Sabocic. I am currently a GIS fellow for the Center for Geospatial Analysis here at William & Mary. And as Sushma said, today I'm gonna give you some insight into a project I worked on for about a year and a half with Sushma, with Rob, and then with my third advisor, Pam Collins, at Conservation International. And this project was titled Mapping the Relationship Between Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities' Lands and Ecosystem Goods and Services. So the concept for this project comes at the intersection of these two really broad issues. So the first is an ecological issue of global biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation that I know we're all really familiar with and talk about often in the conservation world. But there's also the sociological issue that Sushma introduced, in that we're aware that IPLCs, which are indigenous peoples and local communities, steward at least 50% of lands globally and are incredibly important, not just for ecological reasons like carbon and biodiversity and a variety of ecosystem services, but also cultural and intrinsic reasons as well. In light of that, though, IPLCs often face tenure insecurity and a lack of recognition for their lands and their sustainable land management. So there's this sociological conflict as well as this ecological conflict. And our idea for this project was to look at IPLCs and their stewardship through the lens of ecosystem services in an effort to elevate the practices that they do on their lands to steward these important areas and just their tenure in general. So the main question we posed to connect these ideas was how much do areas that provide ecosystem services overlap with lands that IPLCs manage and live on? And we decided to address this with two main objectives. So the first was a global analysis where we just wanted to put a number to how much overlap is there between where IPLC's lands are and where areas that provide ecosystem services are. And then we wanted to focus a little more specifically on a regional area within Africa to see whether the amount of rights IPLCs have on a range that I'll talk about in just a moment has an effect on the performance level of ecosystem services. And this was under the hypothesis that with enhanced tenure rights in an area, perhaps there would be a higher performance level for ecosystem services. And the overall goal with this was just to explore the relationship between indigenous peoples' lands and ecosystem services management, because this is certainly an emerging field. We know how important IPLC's lands are, and we have identified these ecosystem crises, but there hasn't been a lot of work to connect these. There's been some connecting them through the lens of protected areas. There's been some through carbon and biodiversity, but not a lot of folks have looked at ecosystem services as a whole, which is very important for everybody across the planet who uses these services, as well as policies around 30 by 30 and some other initiatives towards conserving these services. So our first objective, again, was to just quantify the overlap between where are indigenous peoples and where are ecosystem services areas. So we ended up with this first global overlay, and you can see in green are areas that IPLCs steward, and this was the most comprehensive layer we had to date from the World Center for Monitoring Conservation. And then we also had this layer from my advisor Pam and her colleague Mark Mulligan, who developed an ecosystem services model that's a combination of lots of different ecosystem services. So it gives a really nice big picture of where ecosystem services areas are. And that is on a nice purple scale. So those darker purple areas are where we have the most ecosystem services provisioning, and those areas that are white or lighter purple are less ecosystem services provisioning. And you'll note that there are some yellow areas where our model does not have ecosystem services data, and then there are countries in gray where we currently do not have IPLC lands data. And I want to note that this doesn't mean that there aren't IPLCs in those areas, it just means that we don't have GIS data for it yet, which is a really big area that people are focusing on to build out that data set. So as I mentioned, that first ecosystem services layer is a combination of lots of different services. So after we looked at that first overlay, we wanted to provide more context for what exactly was driving the relationships we were seeing in that combined layer. So we split apart that big layer into 13 different individual layers for all the individual services, and did the same number crunching to figure out the overlap between each of those individual services and indigenous peoples' lands. And just for today, I wanted to provide an example of an area that had high overlap and an example of a layer that had low overlap. So this ecosystem service of grazing, you can see, has pretty high overlap with the indigenous layer. I've put in these nice purple boxes some areas where you can see the purple of the ecosystem services overlapping with the indigenous areas. And then commercial timber was an example of a layer that had less overlap, so you can see a couple pockets of purple where the indigenous layer doesn't quite match up with it. And ultimately, with this global analysis looking at the whole ecosystem services picture, as well as the individual ones, we found that at least 2/3 of IPLC's lands in this big comprehensive layer contain at least some level of ecosystem services provisioning. We also found that of that, at least 1/4 of high-performing ecosystem services areas occur within IPLC areas, which was very significant because there are not so many high-performing areas within the data set, but IPLC's areas really cover these well. From that separated individual analysis, we found that carbon and water are particularly well covered by indigenous areas, and there's a whole suite of other services whose high-performing areas are well covered. So it was clear from this analysis that indigenous lands are very important for ecosystem services. Then we moved on to our second objective, which was looking at that level of rights versus ecosystem services provisioning level. And you'll see on the left the breakdown of how we split up what I'm calling level of rights. So this comes from a really well-known concept in land management called the bundle of rights, where land rights range from access all the way up to alienation. And for the purposes of this analysis, since it's kind of budding and this is the first time somebody looked at this, we decided to make it a little more simple just to get a big picture and split up this layer of rights into full rights, which means IPLCs have all 5 of the bundle of rights, and then partial rights, which means IPLCs have 4 or less. And you can see that reflected on the map on the right, for which the indigenous layer comes from Sushma and her team, because that was the layer that had the most comprehensive tenure information to be able to actually do this kind of analysis. So you'll see in green are the areas where IPLCs have full rights according to our data set, and then in yellow are areas where they have partial rights. And that purple scale and the gray and yellow remain the same from the first map that I showed you. And the interesting thing with this analysis was we found no significant correlation between the levels of rights, so partial versus full, and ecosystem services performance within Africa. And that's simply because nearly all IPLC lands, regardless of whether they were partial or full rights, are ecosystem services provisioning areas. So they were all very important for ecosystem services. Another interesting thing that we noted was that nearly all high-value ecosystem services areas within Africa were outside of both full and partial IPLC areas. So it's clear that the IPLC lands in Africa do have importance, but there's more analysis we'd like to do to determine what's going on with the high-value areas, and we would like to build the data set out more on the IPLC side. So ultimately we determined to defer to the literature here, which recognizes how important IPLC's lands are for those high-performing areas. But with that first objective in mind and this objective on the regional level, our take-home message from all of this is that we found IPLC's lands do overlap with areas that are providing ecosystem services, and there's different levels of overlap, and it depends on where in the world you're looking, the kinds of services you're looking at within that suite of 13, and then the level of provisioning you're looking at, whether you're just looking at all ecosystem services areas or just those that are high-performing. And some caveats I wanted to mention when you're keeping in mind the results of our analysis are the completeness of the IPLC data set, which I mentioned. Many people are tirelessly working to fill this out so we can have even more comprehensive analysis. And there are some factors with the design of our ecosystem services data set up there that have an impact on what exactly that data set shows. So that's just important to keep in mind. The one I'll note is population density. So that is a factor within the ecosystem services data set in the sense that areas that have higher population density end up with a higher ecosystem services score for the fact that people have to be around ecosystem services to use them. However, I'll kind of jump down to the downstream effects. Often IPLCs are in areas with a lower population density but may be providing services for higher population densities that are adjacent, so that can kind of cause some disparities within that ecosystem services data set. There are also historical factors to keep in mind in the sense that IPLCs have often historically been pushed off of their traditional lands onto less productive lands, so that's something to keep in mind when looking on the map and seeing where we've identified IPLCs have lands. And finally, just to note that IPLCs often measure ecosystem and ecological health differently than ecosystem services metrics do. So what we're talking about here in terms of ecosystem services performance level may not necessarily align with what they measure. But ultimately, it was an absolute honor to be a part of this project and elevate how important Indigenous peoples are for ecosystem services and ecological reasons in general, and I am so excited to see how this analysis is carried forward in the future to continue elevating just how important their sustainable land management and areas are, whether that's in policy or on the ground with participatory mapping. And with that, I believe I'm passing it to Brees to talk about her work.
Good morning, everybody. Happy GIS Day. I am Brees Robertson, and you heard from my bio that I did write a book called Protecting the Places We Love that came out last year. And it really is a great compilation of conservation activities happening all over the world, both in our country and other places around the world. And one of the things that in my over 25 years of working in the conservation field that I've developed are what I call these pillars. And these are the pillars that really drive the way that I approach my work. And the first is collaboration, because these problems that we face as humanity are much larger than any one of us or any one organization can tackle alone. And so we really need partnerships and collaboration. I believe strongly in democratizing data and information and making it accessible to everyone, both the experts and the community members, and inclusiveness. We really need to include everyone in our planning processes, especially now. It's more important than ever that everyone feels safe and welcome to come to the table when we're doing planning work and creating our maps that are going to guide strategic decision making. And we are really experiencing unprecedented times, as everyone knows, and everything from the disappearance of nature due to land development and human development, climate change. We're seeing, worse wildfires, the biggest wildfires we've ever seen in the western part of this country, hurricanes. You're experiencing, some of the effects here of these hurricanes and typhoons globally. And one thing that COVID did show us is that there is a big inequity and big problem with people's access to nature and open spaces. And you did that analysis that showed that right here in Richmond. And so we need to be able to address these things. On the flip side, we are also in an unprecedented time where we have over $1 trillion that has been unlocked and is starting to flow in our country through some of these different acts. So the Land and Water Conservation Fund was permanently passed last year. That's a dedicated amount of funding that $900 million a year for land protection. We've got the Inflation Reduction Act, the America the Beautiful initiative, Justice 40. All of these things, I don't think people realize this. When you put it all together, we're going to see over $1 trillion flowing over the next 3 to 7 years in this country. And our job as GIS professionals is to help our communities be ready to absorb this funding. A lot of this funding requires a match, so communities have to have funding to be able to bring these resources in. And what better way to show the need than to use GIS and strategic planning and decision making to show where these funds are most needed. And in a lot of these initiatives, our work is actually written into the initiative language. So I love this little excerpt from the America the Beautiful initiative where it talks specifically about why it's important to engage communities in our planning processes, but that sound data and science and research and great mapping are really going to be at the core of driving where these funds are spent on protecting lands in our country. This is an example. Rob mentioned the story map we worked with Christina and Johnny on, and this is an example of what came out of that story map. So the Santa Fe Conservation Trust, they focus in this Galisteo Basin watershed area. And within that area, all the white is private land, privately owned land. And then the purple parcels that you see there, those are places that the Conservation Trust has actually worked with private landowners to place conservation easements. And so you can kind of start to see a pattern or a corridor along those purple parcels. And what they're doing here is they're creating a corridor between the Sandia mountain chains and the Sangre de Cristo mountain chain. And that's a very important linkage for bears, mule deer, mountain lions, birds, butterflies through that area. And it's a very important project locally, but it's also part of this larger Western Wildways network, which you can see here that runs all the way from Mexico up through Canada to Alaska. So the work that we do locally in our communities to protect places, it's important to think about how those flow up into larger efforts that are happening at the transcontinental and then at the global scale. But as Rob said, this story map was key for Santa Fe Conservation Trust to to land some funding to create a $1 million endowment that is going to help them work with communities that they have never been able to work with before and to protect more lands. My career at the Trust for Public Land, I was there for 18 years, and it's a national conservation and park organization, and we did a lot of work on looking at communities' access to green space and also where green infrastructure implementations could have the biggest impact for communities for climate resilience and equity. And so this is a great example. On the left-hand side is a school parking lot. You know, there are so many schools in the New York City area where this is where the kids play. It's concrete, you know, a lot of runoff happens here, so there's a lot of flooding in the neighborhoods in this area, and concrete absorbs heat, so it's pretty hot in these areas. And when I was at the Trust for Public Land, we were able to pinpoint using GIS and probably a similar analysis that you saw earlier to show where green schoolyards could make a big difference in communities for climate resilience. And this one park absorbs 500,000 gallons of stormwater a year. The trees help cool the neighborhood down by anywhere from 5 to 12 degrees during urban heat island events. And it's open to the public after school hours. So everybody can come and use this park, you know, as a beautiful asset for recreation. And then these are green alleyways in Los Angeles. There's over 900 miles of green alleys in LA alone. And they're usually places for trash, you know, they're trash dumps, they're not safe for communities to use. And we worked with different neighborhoods to transform those into green alleys. And so again, these absorb storm water, they act as a place for people to gather, and they can also use these alleyways to commute and move around the community in a safe way. So these are just two examples of solutions that we have, and I believe that we have a lot of the solutions that we need to combat climate change. We're just not scaling them fast enough. And so there's a real opportunity for us as GIS professionals to use our data, our research, our information, and community engagement to identify where these solutions, you know, could really scale to make a big difference. And the community, working with communities is so important because they're the ones that have that deep knowledge of place. They're the people that are experiencing, you know, these climate threats. And they're also the people that should be at the table to help us identify what the different solutions could be. So I can't stress enough, you know, when we're creating our maps, it's so important along the way, and creating our data and our research to engage the community. And some of you may be working with tools like Survey 123 and other community engagement tools, but GIS can really help provide those mechanisms to engage communities that wouldn't normally be at the table. There's so much data and so many maps and applications coming out every day. Does anybody feel like there's a tidal wave of data coming out all the time, and what do I use and how do I use it? But all of these data sets and applications are really powerful. These are just a few. This is the homeowners, the redlining data that actually Justin and his team created from the University of Richmond that's readily available to everybody to use in your analyses. And you can also use the application itself. This is a ParkServe application we built when I was at the Trust for Public Land, focusing on park equity and communities. EPA just came out with a new version of their environmental justice screen, and states are starting to come out with their own version of environmental justice data as well. Ecosystem Services, EPA also just updated their Enviro Atlas. And this is all data that you can use within these applications, but you can also pull it out into your own desktop for analyses. This is some climate and biodiversity data on wildfire hazards and the Nature Conservancy's Resilient Land Mapping tool, which shows how climate is going to affect different ecosystems and habitats over the years, and you can incorporate that into your planning work. And this is a map from the NatureServe data where they created maps of biodiversity importance. This shows in yellow those areas that have the highest imperiled species rating. And so we can do with this data, this yellow layer is that imperiled species data layer. We can overlay on protected lands that are either fee or easement protected lands in green. So you can see, what's protected and what's not. This is along the Denver Front Range area in Colorado. So you can see there's a lot of land that isn't already protected. And then when you overlay the TNC resilient lands data of climate refugia and how that's going to change, it really starts to tell a story about how species are being affected by human development, and can pinpoint, where properties can help us protect specific species, like this hops example. I'm currently working with the Trust for Public Land, not the Trust for Public Land, with One Tree Planted, and I have been with One Tree Planted for 2 months, so brand new at this position as the Director of Impact Assessment and Monitoring. And I'm really excited to be a part of this organization. We are on track to plant 50 million trees by the end of this year, and we're working all over the country. And what I am working on is building out a geospatial system for One Tree Planted so we can understand the impacts of these reforestation and restoration and regeneration projects that we're doing all over the world. Not only how many trees are we planting and how many survive, but what are the ecosystem services benefits? What are the biodiversity benefits? What are the economic benefits to the communities where we're working? And so we're doing a lot of really interesting things with drones, capturing 360-degree photos so we can really hone in on where the trees are being planted and then have a record of that year to year, and then be able to use this type of imagery to do analysis where we can pinpoint over the years how much carbon are these places sequestering, how much biodiversity habitat is being protected. And then using products like upstream lens and high resolution remotely sensed data to look at vegetation changes after wildfires or things like that. So there's just so much data out there now that's available that can help give us better insights into the past, where we are now, and then think about the future and how conservation can really help us combat these issues that we're facing. And GIS helps us be much more proactive and strategic in the work that we do through decision support. And then also, we need to be able to tell our stories and increase the visibility of what we're doing and what we're helping our communities and our organizations do around the world, and to be accountable. That's going to become more and more important to be able to measure the impacts of our work into the future, especially as these funds start flowing for this work. People are going to want to measure those impacts. I wrote this book, and Esri actually gave us a discount on GIS Day. So if anybody's interested in purchasing the book for a 30% discount, it is available to you. You have to use this link in that code at the bottom of the screen here. And I think Anita will probably share that out with everybody. But the book really talks about how to map, model, and analyze a lot of these issues that we're talking about, and how to really integrate GIS into conservation operations and organizations. So I'll just leave you with, we have big challenges out there, but I truly believe that we can succeed in meeting our 20 by 30 goals and 20 by 50 goals, and we have to do it together. So thank you very much. I think we'll break here and then take some questions from the audience.
Thank you to our panelists. That was fantastic and a wealth of information. I have several questions here. I'm going to kick us off with a quick discussion. I'll turn it over to the audience and our folks joining us virtually. If you have any questions, start formulating those that we can ask the panelists. So my first question is, we talked a lot about data access, information, a little bit of gatekeeping and bringing people to the table. So I guess my question is, and this is not my quote, this is Rob's quote from last evening. It got me thinking about how we're data rich but information poor. And there's so much out there, there's so much great data that can help us make decisions to help our climate, to help vulnerable communities. What barriers exist to organizations and communities in using GIS for conservation efforts? Because as we all know, we've all probably GIS users to some extent, and we know the barriers of entry and how complex it could be. So what do you think are the barriers to organizations and maybe how we get over those? Brees looks ready to jump in. Or Rob.
Well, there are many barriers, capacity, expertise, access to data, data resolution, data scale. There are just so many barriers. But I think, too, that the GIS technology has become much more easy to use. And, with story mapping and other tools like that, it makes it more accessible for people to understand what's available, to understand complex results or analyses, complex results from analyses and research. So I think it's getting better. But the one thing I see across organizations across the globe is that, a lot of times they can only afford to hire one GIS person, if that, and that person is in charge of doing every single thing, from creating a map to doing analysis to creating donor reporting or partnership reporting, and so capacity is a big issue. But I'm sure you all have something to add.
I might add, I know from the capacity development side, I think there's a need to demystify what GIS is and spatial analysis is, because I think oftentimes we go in to teach GIS and we think, boy, people really need to learn everything about GIS in order to be a GIS practitioner, when what we should be thinking about is how can we give people and how can we build capacity around the understanding of the use of spatial data. And so it doesn't have to be which button to push, all the little details, but rather what are the bigger issues that could be addressed through the use of spatial data. And once you build those ideas, then I think the rest of it kind of falls into place. And it's something I've noticed working with communities that if I try to dig too much into the really hardcore GIS stuff, we lose participants, we lose interest. But when you talk about those bigger issues, then communities find a way to connect with the use of spatial data, and it motivates them to continue to work in that area.
Yeah, from the perspective of indigenous peoples and local communities, there's a lot of barriers, including the physical barriers in terms of accessing these as a tool, even accessing internet or computer or hardware to work on this. But communities do know that these are mapping is an important ways to take their voices out there in the world, and to show that what they have been doing for the millennia. But definitely the barrier is in terms of accessing this first, and the second is really taking this knowledge, the mapping knowledge, GIS, to the communities. And as you know, indigenous peoples and local communities are the marginalized communities in terms historically and currently as well, and that means access to education and all that is still a barrier, and that means using these kind of tools is by themselves is a hard, difficult thing. And so I think there's opportunities for GIS practitioners and conservation and other organizations to take this to people to build the capacity so that they can continue this on their own rather than also depending on other people to do this for them. But until then, I think we have opportunity to support them, like the one that you were doing for the One Trust Foundation. So yeah.
Yeah, and I would echo what the other three panelists have said, and then say from a perspective of how we could maybe overcome, especially some of those capacity barriers. Something I've noticed at the Center for Geospatial Analysis is just looking beyond that concept of the GIS specialists and the hardcore GIS use, and to what we can just do with students who are just learning GIS. At the CGA, we engage a lot of our introductory students who are currently enrolled in the class in GIS research for real-world clients. We have students working with local mosquito groups and analyzing their data on trapping data in West Nile virus. We have students doing asset management for parking and transportation here on campus. We have students doing story maps for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service because that's something that they learn in that entry-level class. So I think getting creative about who we can involve in GIS and just extending those opportunities to them is very important. And for them, the most important thing is just gaining that experience and getting some of the maybe more expertise with button clicking, but then understanding how it works to use GIS beyond the classroom. So I think some of those solutions for just engaging beyond maybe what people would first think of with GIS technicians and specialists can kind of overcome some of those issues.
Fantastic. Well, I lied. I got one more question, and then I'll turn it over. This is too much fun. So a resounding theme that I heard was ownership and rights, and I think that's a really big piece to many conversations around conservation and environmental justice. And historic ownership has been a really important topic, especially in the United States, and also around the world when we think about power in vulnerable communities. So I guess how do we, ownership has a lot been about wealth extraction, right, from those vulnerable communities. So how do we think about showing value in giving power back to those communities and keeping green space, like the park you showed, right? There's so much value in that, right? But a lot of people approach value from monetary and say, okay, I can charge so much for people to park there, right? But what's the natural value out of that? So I guess my question is, how do we help show value in giving power back to vulnerable communities?
Anyone want to?
Jump, please.
Yeah, I think part of the value here has to be an interpretation of what you mean by value. And for me, part of the value of this work and of the use of GIS to address environmental justice issues is not necessarily the value in the land, but the value in data sovereignty and the value that people and communities have when they have tenure rights and ownership over the natural resources that are part of their land. And so whether you say the value is a monetary value, it's a cultural value, a historic value, to me it's really wrapped up into that idea that ownership, sovereignty, the ability to manage and understand what happens on their lands is critically important. And I think one way to do that is through the use of geospatial tools. And so my answer is, I'm not sure, there certainly are ways to value nature. We could look at payments for ecosystem services as an example of that, carbon storage, but the true value is in the ability to make your own decisions.
Yeah. Just adding on to that, mapping and all these things it can be very, very useful, critical for recognizing indigenous peoples and local communities, lands and waters, their tenure rights. But we also have to ensure that it doesn't perpetuate the injustices and inequalities, because sometimes when and it depends on what the communities want. Do you have a consent to map those lands, and do they even want their lands to be recognized? Maybe they don't. They just want to not be in the legal system. They just want to continue doing doing the customary communal ways of lives and continue to do that because the legal systems may be too burdensome for them. And so it's really about what the communities want. Do you have getting that consent, and do they really want to legally be recognized, their lands to be recognized or not? But also when we map, ensuring that we are not perpetuating that injustices by making other communities invisible. Like, for example, when we sometimes map things, we are always looking at where's the most carbon that's concentrated, where's the most, the biodiversity, and what about the communities that may not live in lands, like Christina was saying, that sometimes communities are pushed into marginalized environments. What about them? And so we have to be very careful about all of that this is such a powerful tool, but how do we make it inclusive, as you said? How do we make this a inclusive technology that everybody can participate and everybody can be empowered? And the idea about data sovereignty is very important, and that's who is the owner of the data that we all work with, and that's something we cannot answer this today, but it's an important one, and that's a conversation that's happening within the indigenous communities about who is the owner of their data. So yeah, thanks for that question, Justin.
Yeah, I'll just add, maps are powerful, and they can be very helpful, and they can also be harmful. And so we have to consider that around the data that we're using and the way we display information on maps. Got a good friend that works for the Grand Canyon Trust. I think you guys have worked with them as well. And she was working on some maps for the reinstating of the Bears Ears National Monument in Utah in the Four Corners area. And she was working with all the tribes and came in with the map, just a base map. And it was the typical base map we all would create, with state boundaries and county boundaries and cities, and very little resource information on the map. And the tribe said, this isn't how we even think about this landscape. It's cultural for us, it's spiritual. And so she had to go back to the drawing board and come in with this map that was completely different, no boundaries, traditional boundaries on the map, and then the tribe used that to create the map that became the newly reinstated Bears Ears National Monument. So we just have to be very thoughtful and careful about how we even show up with that first map to engage communities.
Can I add one more thing on that? Just the part that the world is so global now, and then data is very important. It's out there, and open access data is very important, especially if we want to really solve this, existential crisis of climate and biodiversity loss. And so these data, they do need to be out there for people to use. So there's a very delicate balance to strike for what's important to people that cannot be out there, but what should be out there. And so yes, that's a conversation that I think we should all have going forward as well.
And I wanted to echo what others have said. The word that's coming to me is intentional, so being very careful and thoughtful and intentional about what you're doing with the mapping technologies, because I might be a bit biased as a GIS person, but I think that maps are an incredible communication tool, can really be more accessible to people beyond just like very jargon-heavy scientific literature. I think it can connect a lot more people with the issues that we're really passionate about. But at the same time, something I learned working on this project with Sushma was just that at each stage of the way, you have to be so careful about what you are showing with your map, because if a picture paints 1,000 words, I think a map paints thousands of words. So you have to be so cautious about understanding what it's showing, and part of that for us was just working with lots of different people and getting different perspectives on what we were showing beyond just what we were looking at as the people who were most familiar with the data. So I think part of showing the value of areas is working with the people who that affects directly, which Sushma covered very well, talking about working with those communities and what exactly they would like to see. I think that is incredibly important.
Thank you. So I believe we have some microphones for the audience and everyone joining us virtually. If you want to put your question in the chat, we will make sure it gets answered.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for these presentations, very illuminating. I do have a follow-up question on the one that was posed initially in terms of data and in terms of the quality of the data, access to the data, and also how to incorporate data into more dynamic monitoring. So in terms of quality of the data, I think we all agree that collecting data on IPLCs is very, very important, right? It has all these different uses, you already addressed the question of data sovereignty and question of ownership of the data. But I just want to raise attention also to the issue of quality of the data. So for example, like you mentioned that for the mapping that was done with Conservation International, that you use data for WCM, right? So I was just wondering about if there are any ways in which the users and producers of this data have been thinking about maybe establishing a protocol for what should be quality standards in the use of this data. Just one quick example, if you look at the case of Mexico, right, as was shown in your map, the entire country appears to be green, right, which will be like under IPLCs. And this has to do with the HIDO system. But in the HIDO system, I mean, like basically some of the HIDO system is managed as private property with private parcels, which will be a far cry from how we might imagine the common lands that we associate under IPLC management, right? So there is that question of the distinction between these different community regimes, and probably one that is also as important is the question of land tenure security, right? Because on the one hand, like we can look and collect data on the de jure rights, like those rights that will appear, you know, like based on a bundle of rights, but how are these rights actually enforceable in practice, right? So there is a different set of practitioners who have been doing different indices about how to measure land tenure security or so on, and of course it will be complicated to try to think of ways of integrating them, but I think that's probably the direction that we need to be looking forward, is like, you know, so we have this information on where these lands are, but how much security do they actually afford, right? And the second question in terms of access to the data, if you have any comments, I mean, like, I think that one issue of access to is licensing, right? I mean, if we continue to rely on software that requires a license that you have to pay for, that is in itself going to offer some limitations, right? So how can we balance the powerful tools that are provided by certain proprietary softwares with open access data, with open access software that could be distributed much more easily and could be done more collaboratively in the development of these different tools, right? So we don't have to depend also on one provider for this software. And third, on how to incorporate it into more dynamic monitoring, I was just wondering, because I mean, like, for example, many of the ways that was shown of how GIS can contribute to the greening of cities also could have the invert effect of gentrification, right? As has been shown in many cases where there is green areas, parks that are provided, and property prices increase, and that creates another wave of displacement, right? So have there been any examples maybe of incorporating also GIS in community efforts to sort of try to mitigate some of these potential consequences that could come from the well-intentioned plans to green and beautify cities? Thank you, and I think, you know, like all these comments / questions are more in terms of thinking how to continue with this increasingly challenge, right, that we have ahead of us. Thank you.
So I believe I heard data quality, software, and proprietary licensing and barrier to access, and then two, utilizing open data, right, in communities.
Start with data quality and IPLCs.
I don't quite understand probably on the data quality, but what I do want to add is that even though that these data on indigenous peoples and local communities have been collected and aggregated by various organizations, you know, the data itself, the database and the maps itself need to get into the hands of the people, and they should be able to access this data, and that should be one of the ways that we can take the data to the communities, that ensuring that they have access to this data and they can use it as appropriately, you know, however they see it fit, in whatever ways, whether that is conservation, climate, sustainable development conversations, take it to national or global policy forums and platforms. But I did wanted to add on the land, the security, tenure security, which is that recognition of lands doesn't automatically equals to land tenure security. There are lots of other things that needs to be added. And one you pointed out is yes, these rights may be on the paper, it's recognized, but is it enforced? Is it respected? And do the communities actually have the capability to do so, because those rights may not be comprehensive. As I showed in the map, they may just be managers of their land. They may not be able to exclude, illegal loggers or miners, for example. And so, yeah, that's a big issue. And then land tenure security also requires other things. We need to go beyond just looking at the tenure recognition. So, building the capacities of or developing actually the capacities of the communities in terms of accessing finance, direct access to finance, so that they can steward their lands and continue to do so. Same with enhanced participation in global climate and conservation fora, how to build and develop that capacity. So, yeah, tenure security doesn't stop at the recognition of land rights and the rights of the people. It depends on the depth and the comprehensiveness of those rights. I guess I'm going away a little bit from your question, but yeah, and definitely understand the complexity. So you gave the example of ejidos in Mexico, and yeah, it's that's why I think the tenure explicit map is lacking in the GIS world, is because of that. It's very complex, and it differs by communities, by countries, of course, by what kind of laws it is, what kind of tenure regime, the legislation and the rules that are out there that establishes a certain system or that provides the rights to the people. And so it's very complicated, and I think our work is in some ways trying to make this less complicated for people, but it is complicated. I don't know I answered your question, but...
Do you want to go?
Sure. So I will address maybe two of your questions around proprietary software. I think this is really where nonprofit organizations and universities and partnerships can come into play. A lot of organizations around the world are never going to have GIS or have the capacity to use it, to do really deep spatial analysis, but we can help them. We can create these maps, we can create applications. I showed some of them that everyone has access to, that are democratized, and engage those communities as we're figuring out what data to use and what applications to build, and what would be most helpful and useful to them. There's pros and cons to open source and proprietary software. We could have a whole nother panel on that. But that's one answer to that question. And then as far as the gentrification question, I have seen and have directly worked with communities to use geospatial data to, number one, identify that their neighborhood does not have trees, it does not have parks, it's very deficit in green, and that the people really want that, but they also don't want displacement and gentrification. And so I think mapping can be a first step in unearthing the issue, and then a tool to engage city councilors, county commissioners, other policymakers and decision makers in what needs to happen beyond the map, in the policy realm or the regulatory realm, to make sure that people can stay in those communities, their taxes don't go way up. So there's just a lot of different mechanisms that you can use, but in a lot of cases it does all start with the map and identifying the problem and then figuring out what the solutions are from there.
I might add just an add-on to that is, if you look back at, there's a wonderful professor at University of Washington, Sarah Elwood, who did amazing work in the city of Chicago to provide local communities the ability to map what was in their community as an argument to bring more resources to the community. So I think there is, like Bruce was saying, there is this opportunity to work with local communities But the map just shows the issue, and then you need to bring that out to the policymakers. I did want to touch on one other point, that your idea about, well, this idea about access to data. And for me, I don't think it's just access to data. It shouldn't end at, here's the data. It should be access to data as well as the ability to edit and update the data from the local communities. And that's where we're really going to make a difference, because if we have a map that's entirely wrong, giving them the data doesn't help if they can't say, well, this is wrong and this is where the changes need to be made. And where that touches on your last point about this idea of software and open source versus licensed software, I also think we can get away from the idea of what GIS software is. And we've seen examples, and we've worked on examples where you can, William & Mary can build a really great website that anyone can access and draw data on. So we had this project with Wildlife Conservation Society and their Mesoamerica program to identify places that were ripe for restoration of forests. And it was an open data site where anyone who had the link to the website could go on and draw polygons. And that's a GIS. And so if we get away from this idea that GIS is this software that we sit down in front of a computer and work on, and it could be much broader than that. It could be these geo applications and some of the new tools, even data collection that's become much easier through good GIS companies, but now provide us a way to collect point lines and polygons on our phone. We can get away from, well, we need access to ArcGIS Pro in order to be able to do GIS. And I think that makes a difference as well.
Great. All right, I think we have time for one more question.
Good morning, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. You all talked about the importance of working with local communities to create site-specific solutions to conservation problems, and I was wondering if you could expand on the intricacies of that process.
Working with local communities to create site-specific answers to problems, and expand on that a little bit. So some experience working with local communities?
Yeah, when I was at the Trust for Public Land, we created a green printing process, which was a community-driven conservation planning process. And engaging the community takes time, and it's often the most expensive part of a project or a program, but it's also the most important. And so in those cases, we would gather, different community members, both decision makers, and just meet. We would put up a table at the pool on Saturday morning or go to the local football game on a Friday night, and really try to engage with as many people as possible that wouldn't come to a meeting. For example, they couldn't or wouldn't, or because of various reasons. And so they really helped set the stage for what was important for conservation and land protection in those communities, and then worked with us throughout the whole process, providing information and input on the maps, on the places, even on site design for parks and open spaces. And so it's a big process to engage the community, but it's really, an important process. And I think, making sure that you're giving everybody in the community the opportunity to engage if they can is really important.
I think like participatory mapping would be something that comes to mind for me, like resource mapping with the community. So we have the map, then you can take it to the community, and then, as Rob was saying, editing it in a way so that adding more richer, more nuanced understanding of the landscape and the seascapes, because they know the lands better than all of us, because they live there, and they have accumulated the knowledge systems to live and survive in those places. And so I think it's one example that I think of it is it can be global or local, but you take that map and work with the communities to capture whatever is important to them. If it's a resource mapping because they wanted to see where they're, where are the important places for water resource, or the forest areas that they get their fuel woods from, or medicinal plants from. If that's the what community wants to know, and give put this out into the world, then we take that data, we work with the community in that way. In other ways also, this is a more global, you're talking about more site specific. We know from all of the maps now established that indigenous peoples' lands and places, their territories and lands are very important, carbon-rich, biodiverse areas. But it's not a coincidence that it is, or they are, because it's their practices, the cultural understanding, cultural practices, knowledge systems. And so one of the things that we are doing at CI is then to understand the mechanisms why these places are carbon-rich, intact, or any of those biological indicators are so high. Why? And so for that, you talk to the people. You talk to them about what practices that they do, what knowledge systems that they carry forward, what kind of, now the climate is changing, the knowledge is not static either. Is it changing? How are they adapting? And things like that. So even if it's global, sometimes you can go out there and collect information that way by talking to people.
I'll just add just one more quick thing. At One Tree Planted, we're really building the capacity of our planting partners all over the world, and going out and meeting with them. Some of them want drones. They want to learn how to use drones, and so we will teach them how to use drones to capture imagery for monitoring and evaluation and verification. So I think capacity building is also really important on the side of community engagement.
Great questions. So we hope you join us for the afternoon session, University of Richmond, where we'll be continuing this discussion and talking a little bit more about local communities. So we hope you can join us there and maybe bring your questions with you. So I'll turn it back over for final remarks.
Thank you, everyone. On behalf of everyone, I want to thank our wonderful panelists for bringing up all those topics of so much concern. Not only bringing the topics, but also showing us ways we can solve the issues. I think it's so important and very thoughtful way to start the World GIS Day. I'm sure these topics and ways to contribute will haunt us as GIS professionals for a few weeks or months to think about ways that we can contribute. Thank you again. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We have 2 more events today. In the York Room here in the Sadler Center, there is an event at 10:45 where you can have conversation about the international careers in conservation. We have food. Let's meet there. And if you are planning to attend the afternoon session at the University of Richmond, and through the Zoom link also, you have to scan the QR code. So please scan the QR code and let's attend the event in the afternoon. Thank you, everyone.